Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also 92.1 over there at the other station. That is WFOV, and we're very glad that both the audiences are here today. We tape every Monday from 2 o'clock until 3, and then we air the program again on 92.1 on Saturdays at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're always glad to have the people who pay attention to what we're doing here. We're always very pleased to have you with us, and we hope to be able to say a few things that no one else is saying. Some points being made here that not made anywhere else.
Also, I'd like to encourage people to go to our YouTube channel on YouTube. It's All Points TV on YouTube. Subscribe to it also, so that way you can get noticed too when we go up live. If you can't can listen to it full, you can listen to the full show. That even including the 4 minutes that are we have a brief spell where we're not with the the audience there at WFOV, so you can get the whole what's going on totally. No pun intended. Know what's going on totally with uninterrupted. So anyway, but definitely encourage. We also thank WFOV for allowing us to be part of their programming.
John, did you watch this program that comes on at 9 o'clock on Fox on Sundays? They have this program by Steve Hilton, The New Revolution. That's a very good program. It comes on before Mark Levine's program comes on. It's only aired one day a week. And I'm beginning to pay attention to it. I missed it when it first came on, but for the last 3 or 4 weeks I've been watching the program. That is a very good program. And another program they have is the one that is Carson's program, and I think he does a very good job. He comes on 5 days a week. I don't know if you're aware of his program, but those are two good programs that they have some very good news items on there, and they seem to be pretty straight shooters, which is very rare these days as far as people willing to bring the news without all the bias that we're getting right now. You know how people are inputting their own views into the news. We don't know if they're newscasters or they're propagandists.
That's the thing is, like, it's so weird that you got to listen to all these different channels, try to discern what the truth is, because some groups out there, the more left, is always saying it's absolutely certain that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians to win this election, and then the other ones say, well, I don't know which path to take. Is it possible that somebody use computer systems? They're hackable. If you want to avoid that, avoid the computers. I mean, they're the ones that pushed us forward anyway. These people are now whining about is allegedly being so easily to hack. They're the ones who pushed us to do this. Why don't we just do our elections, wait a couple of days, you find out the verdict of it or the outcome, and instead of having everything on computers so it could be so easily manipulated. That's problem solved. Okay, why can't they do that? Nope, they won't do that.
We have been investigating Russian collusion with the Donald Trump administration supposedly for the last 14 months. And every investigative arm that we put out there to prove the issue has come up without any results. And so this idea that we're going to continue this investigation just shows you again that we have an operation in place here that's being marshaled by the deep state. We don't have any evidence that there was any collusion in this election. And this is really targeted at the American people who have the audacity, John, to go and defy their rulers, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and install someone from the outside.
Well, you know what it is? What the left is trying to do, though, by doing this, always saying they're going to investigate Trump for this collusion, they're trying to get us to step forward who voted for Trump and say we voted for him, so they could turn out and publicly humiliate you, put you in the stocks, basically, so they can humiliate you. And that's all the left is degenerate to, is because you're not supposed to look out for your own interest. You're supposed to give up your own interest for everybody else's interest, and if you call a timeout on that, on this erosion of your individual rights, you're a wacko or you're mean-spirited or other kinds of abuse they could dump on you. And that's what they basically do. They use shaming techniques. Because they say guilt is useless emotion. That's BS, because they've always utilized it. You can't use it on them because they have no more consistent basis to make an argument on.
I couldn't agree with you more. This shaming of the voters for going to non-politicians and trying to put someone in there who had never held elective office before is a defensive move on the part of the American people, who have been figuring out for a while now, and I think it culminated in the election of 2016. They figured out that neither one of those parties and those that are inside of the power centers in politics representing the interests of the American people of the American Republic. So they went to the outside and brought someone in who had never held elective office before, and what we're seeing now is the deep state or the state itself fighting back. They have not accepted the results of the election, and this is going on in November of this year will be 2 years. So they are simply telling us in a very indirect way, but if you can read the tea leaves and interpret what's going on here, they're telling the American people they have no right to make their determinations away from the decision makers in this country. And for the American people, they've gone to the polls on November the 8th, 2016, and elected a non-politician into the highest office in the country. They're not going to tolerate that. And if you have been paying attention, you see they're going from one thing to another in order to rescind the verdict that was marshaled into the political process by the American people. We weren't supposed to act this way on November the 8th, 2016. But the American people took the bull by the horn. They went to the polls and they elected Donald Trump as president of the United States. And the rulers are not going to take that without a fight.
So you see that there's that deep state scenario is going on really when you look at the Republicans who decide not to run. Again, like Paul Ryan coming to mind, the first one, because let's face it, they're saying, oh crap, these people are actually changing. They don't want what we've been doing. We've been paid well to do what we've been doing. So we can't change because our real masters are gonna come after us. So they're ditching. They're pulling out. That's what it is, because they don't want to be. They're saying they're an embarrassment. How is more embarrassment than Bill Clinton's done? I mean, it would be more. It would have made news if Bill Clinton actually slept with his own wife. Okay, instead, I mean, it was common, and they kept on telling us. The left kept on telling us that kind of stuff doesn't matter. Well, they convinced the American population to overlook that, and now they're trying to use it as a ram against the Trump supporters. It's not working. So what if you hired a prostitute or a porn star to have sex with
10 years ago?
10 years ago. Yeah, and let's face it. The thing is, he's not like a politician. He used his own money. They would have used our money.
Well, they keep going from one thing to another. It was going to be the Mueller investigation is going to bring the president down, and then it became the book put out by Comey, and Comey's book is going to reveal some things. There's going to be a smoking gun, and that's going to bring the result about. That hasn't happened. Now it's Stormy Daniels that they went to, and the latest thing is Michael Cohen. They're now saying that Michael Cohen is going to flip, and his insider's information about Donald Trump is going to be the nail in the coffin that ends his presidency. And one guy said this past weekend, as a matter of fact, that he does not think that Donald Trump is going to finish out his term, which everybody's salivating, all the people on the left are salivating over that proposition that he would not finish out his first term. So what they could not do in the wash, which was the election that was held in 2016, they plan to do in the rest, which is I think they're now setting up an impeachment, trying to hold off until we get to the November election, hoping to flip the House, and then having it still in the public domain, not letting go of the issue that he's an illegitimate president. They want to maintain this momentum so that if the House does flip and the Democrats take over the House, and even more unlikely, but maybe this could happen also when they take over the Senate, then they want to bring about the impeachment of the president because they do not accept the results. But what really the issue is that the American people went to the polls and they defied their rulers in this country. And the rulers don't like the idea of them acting independent. And they went outside of the two-party duopoly or the two-party monopoly. If you can call two parties a monopoly rather than just one party. The two-party monopoly, duopoly, the American people went there and decided they're not going to buy either one of these two outlaw groups. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are basically two corrupt agencies that are running this country, and they're running it into the ground, and the people have had enough of it. And because it went outside of it, they have to be punished and put back in their place for having gone to the polls and defied their rulers. And they're trying to act as if that something went on untoward in this election. Otherwise, we would have had fair elections in this country if it had not been for the Russian colluding with the Donald Trump campaign. This result would not have been placed out there in the public arena, and we would not have the person of our choosing. We would have the person of their choosing. Hillary Clinton would be president. And and that's what they're trying to put out there as to why this result took place. The real reason why it took place is that Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate. The Democratic Party was seen for what it is, a corrupt party, and the Republican Party was seen the same way as also a corrupt party, and the people have had enough of it. And this idea that Donald Trump is the person that is under attack here is the American political system that's under attack. The American people in this country, the country itself is under attack, and this anti-democratic posturing that we're seeing in Washington by these investigative units, the FBI, the NSA, the DIA, and these other agencies, even the FISA court set up in 1978, all these agencies are corrupt. And they want to undo an election because the American people went to the polls and took the bull by the horn, and we had a populist uprising in this country that the rulers are not going to accept. Well, you look without a fight.
Well, I don't know if I'm a committed person to get the law of the medical marijuana in Michigan law stand as it is, because it was voted in several years ago by the Michigan voters. Bill Schuette, the Attorney General, and all this guy, they always want to mess with it. They don't think they have this real issue with citizens writing their own laws, because they think that's something that they should do. So they can always find a way exempting themselves or putting in it. So that it goes into this very similar vein there. I mean, they can't stand the fact that people didn't vote for the pro-offer pile of crap called Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. And actually, it was the own Democratic Party that actually screwed over the chance for Bernie Sanders to get any votes because of the way they brokered the deals and stuff. So they have nothing but to fear. They have nothing but who to blame but themselves for that. So I mean, but that's exactly. I see a parallel between what we're doing in Michigan with the Schuette and the Republican Party. And I usually back them on a lot of stuff, who wants to do with the medical marijuana in Michigan, because they cannot stand the fact that you guys took it upon yourself to write it. And that's like, it's arrogance. It's such an arrogance. They say and they want to do it so they can give their friends who are in power, corporations, they want to make it monopoly, giving it to them, taking it in the hands of the caregivers, and it's working fine the way it is now. All their objections are asinine.
John, you gave me a book to read, and I finished it. You gave me a book to read last week, and I finished it. It's called War is a Racket, and I would like to add to that by saying that politics is a racket, and we're seeing this racketeering, this racket being played out right in front of our eyes. You know, I asked a question as I was coming to the studio. I was before I arrived here, I was talking to a person on the street, and we were just kind of talking about some of the things that we see going on. And I asked the question, why do you think that a lot of people, and I've seen Harry do it also, put their hand inside of their coat, the right hand inside of their coat? You saw the most famous picture of that would be Napoleon putting his hand inside of his coat. John, why do you think that goes on, why they put their hand? You have any views on why that goes on, what that hidden hand is about?
I heard that's a Masonic symbol. That's what I've always been told.
It's an initiation symbol. The hidden hand of the hidden hand of government. It's a hidden hand. It's a deep state. You see, you got a lot of different names for it. We used to think it was the Illuminati, some power center above the government. A lot of my friends have this view that there's a hidden hand above the government, and they are, in fact, directing the elected officials to do X, Y, and Z, that if they were not there, then these elected officials would be carrying out the will of the American people, because they're basically a good people, blah, 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 and keep on with that narrative for a while and bore me to tears. The fact of the matter is that the government has always had a hidden hand. And when you have this book called War is a Racket, Politics is a Racket, and has always been a racket, the politicians who are non-producers have got to find some way to justify their existence, because they're non-productive parts of the community, and because of that, they are parasitic influences upon a society, and they have to create certain circumstances that show the people that they really are relevant to the paradigms that are being carried out by society, and they are necessary for those paradigms to be carried out in a way in which it cannot be carried out without their presence. And we have we have this view that politicians are necessary. In fact, one of the professors over at Mott College, formerly at Mott College, was saying, well, what would we do if we didn't have politicians? How could we do without them? And that's not a very large question. We could do without them by having less of a parasitic influence upon society, and we could then develop more of an ethical place to live in, where we're not being set upon by these politicians that are in fact dividing us against each other and then creating a need for their presence.
It's almost like a plaintive, like, called, what would you do without us? And they're hand wringing and they're sweating it out, and they're like, so there's like, I can't believe they're looking and get rid of us. We've done so much for them. You know, it's like, yeah, we want to get rid of you.
Yeah, the politicians are the problem. I had another discussion with another one of my friends, and we were talking about the welfare state. The welfare state comes out of the politicians breaking down the relationships in the community. When I was growing up in Birmingham, the welfare was that was in fact carried out by the people who your next door neighbors. You ran out of flour, you ran next door, and you borrowed flour from your next door neighbor. You knew who he was. He was in your house when his needs were not being met by his own resources. He borrowed resources from next door, and those needs were met. You did the same thing when you had a shortage of your resource base, and you went next door, you borrowed it, paid it back later on, and that interaction between the two of you kept them out of your home. You knew that you didn't have to go in there and take anything from people next door, because it was there for the asking. If they had it, they would give it to you, knowing that you would in fact be good enough to pay it back, because the need would probably present itself in the future. So you needed them, not just in that one time, you needed them in the future as well. That was a relationship that you had there. What the politicians did, they saw that they could in fact develop relevance by taking the welfare out of the hands of the people in the communities and put it in the hands of the state through taxation, taxing money out of the hands of the American people, placed it in the hands of the politician, and then and then they distribute the money that they have confiscated, that they've stolen, because that's what taxation is. Taxation is theft. The money they stole from the American people, they then redistribute the money they took in the name of the politicians for political purposes, and then they can use that as a way of showing their benevolence, and they use that in order to get elected. We'll give you this, and we give you that, and we give you the other thing. The state is actually acting in a way in which they claim is charitable. But you know, and I know, charity is not when you take somebody else's money and then you dispense it in your own name and call that charity. Charity is going in your own pocket, not going in the pocket of the taxpayers. You can't be charitable with somebody else's money. And the thief out there in the street is not being charitable. He takes the money that he steals at gunpoint and then goes out there and gives the money to a person on the street with a tin cup, taking up a collection out there, then he's not being charitable. He's just simply giving the money to someone else that he stole. The charity would be if the person who he stole the money from decides to help that person, and then they determine that they're going to give the person money because they still need to be filled. But you can't be charitable with somebody else's money after you've taken it through confiscatory measures, and that's what the state does. What it does on top of that, and in addition to that, they have taken away from us the camaraderie that our own charitable impulses presented to those around us, and so we were actually doing things that gave the neighbors a reason to have a relationship with us.
Another thing is, if you
no bars up at that time, by the way.
If your neighbor had to ask of you something and you gave it to him because you're trying to be helpful, they would probably feel less reluctant to try to remedy the situation that brought them to that point. Whereas now you got the welfare state, the people who are living on the dole basically feel no compunction whatsoever. There's no accountability, so they can continue with the procedures or the life experiences or whatever the way they do things, the choices they make. They don't have to change them. They don't have to alter them. Matter of fact, now they probably increase the frequency of, say, drug use, or drunkenness, anything else, because now they know their basic needs are covered by the lagresse of the society as a whole. They don't have to address their issues. We have enabled people, generations of people in this country, with the system we have now. And I am the one libertarian who doesn't believe in total elimination of the safety net, because everybody could possibly fall into, like bad times. But we basically, the safety net has become a hammock, and people have been resting there, ordering up lemonade to be brought to them at poolside. That's what it looks like to me, and that's what I have issue with.
Steve, I was talking about Steve Hilton's program that comes on Sundays at 9 o'clock on Fox. I think that's a very good program. He had a guest on his program this past Sunday named Tammy Bruce. You might know her from being the Independent Women's Voice president. And she was talking about these corporates in government who are the ones who are the impediment to the very things they're trying to project. They're trying to say that Russia has interfered with our democracy, and she was making the point that the persons interfering with our democracy are the people that's making the accusation that the Russians are doing it. Certainly Russia would like to influence, but that does not mean that because they seek influence in the elections in this country that they were able to therefore get the Trump administration, all the ones running his campaign, those who were in back of his candidacy, that they were colluding with them to bring the result about. That's a whole different issue. There was no collusion. That's why they're not uncovered in the collusion. And not only do those in the Trump administration know that, those that are investigating him know it. There was no collusion. They are attacking the results of that election because they do not approve of it. And they still have hopes that they're going to be able to rescind the verdict of the American people because that's who they are. Has anyone ever considered, when you look at these politicians, has anyone ever considered that there might be a mental health issue with the political class? Can a person who is not producing anything to further the ends of society, can a person who has no utilitarian value, can that person be well? Is there a certain kind of psychological dismantlement that takes place if you are a parasitic influence, as all politicians are? You see, war is a racket, but in addition to war being a racket, politics is also a racket.
They're intertwined. There's no. I don't see where there's a chance to really separate the two. Usually, that's how politicians gain more control over other people, is to pointing to the other as being the possible source of their problem, and galvanizing people to go to war. So I mean, there's always been connected together.
It is connected, John. The politicians are warmongers because that's how they internationalize their theft. You read the book War is a Racket, and what General Smedley Butler talks about in his book is that before 1898, the United States didn't have any possessions outside of its territorial boundaries. But in the aftermath of the war that was fought in that year, the Spanish-American War, and then that leads into the First World War, and what occurred there, the fact that Wilson, who campaigned in 1912, and I'm sorry, he was elected in 1912. He campaigned for re-election in 1916, and he campaigned upon the slogan, "They kept us out of war." We're going to take a break right now with WFOV, and we will see them back again here at allpointstv.com in 4 minutes. We're glad to have all of you staying tuned to the program, those of you who are with us at allpointstv.com. Wilson campaigned in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Yeah, he did. The war was started in 1914. I don't know if he kept us out of war. We just weren't in the war at that time. But in his second inaugural address, which was given March the 4th, 1917, 1 month later, in April the 6th, the following month, a month hadn't passed before the U.S. was involved in the war. We got involved in the war April the 6th, 1917. So 1 month later, less than 1 month later, we are involved in World War I. So the campaign upon "he kept us out of war" did not mean that he would continue to keep us out of war. And what Smedley Butler says in his book called "War is a Racket," he says that taking all of the diplomatic pretensions out of the conversation, the bankers and some of the people that were diplomats from France and England and other warring nations came to Washington and said, in essence, we're losing this war, and if we lose, the bonds and the monies that have been loaned cannot be paid, and Germany is not going to pay it, and therefore the liabilities that are out there that are owed to you will be out there without any recompense. Therefore, if you do not in fact engage in this war, then all is lost, including your own interests being lost. And out of that conversation, the U.S. now, 1 month after the inauguration of Wilson for the second term, Wilson has the U.S. involved in the war, and we got 4 million men in arms. So he campaigned on one thing, and then the politicians found some way of selling the war to the American people, meaning that selling it by way of saying that this is a war to end all wars. Let me tell you something. As long as you have politicians on the planet, as long as you have governments which are run by politicians, as long as you have war as a racket and politics as a racket, you're going to have warfare. And you have it right now in terms of what they're doing with Syria. They don't have any proof that the Syrian government would have acted in a kamikaze way as they're trying to make it appear that Assad would have gone out there and used gas. The United States was getting ready to pull out of Syria, so Assad then goes out there and use chemical weapons. They will bring them back into Syria. See, war is a racket. You're right. He's right. Smedley is right. Smedley Butler is right. War is a racket. But politics is a racket too. And I'm glad that we are now being joined again with the listeners over at WFOV 92.1. We're glad to have you back. And we are still talking about war is a racket and politics is a racket. And we're seeing evidence of it by what's going on in Washington right now. We don't want to recognize, by the way, that our government is just as corrupt as governments are in other parts of the world. Our government is not better. The American people are better. Not to say that other people are not deserving as American people are deserving, but the point I'm trying to make here is that it's the American people that have made this country great, not these politicians. And I have been watching how these historians have been trying to sell this noise, and it is noise, that we have had great political leaders. We haven't had great political leaders.
The one I point to is Calvin Coolidge, because he did exactly what I think a president should be. He remained administrator rather than try to be create this cult of personality around himself, like 9 out of 10 had done so far afterwards. I mean, they always want to build this like, oh my God, he was such a great man kind of thing. I mean, do what you have to do and get judged by the merits or demerits and on whatever. But I mean, these guys like Obama, oh my God, he wanted to be adored. He said anything he could to be adored. Trump's pissing people off. So I don't think he's even trying to do that. I don't know if he's doing everything he should or the right way, but he's not trying to right now to try to be epic. I mean, it's serious,
Calvin Coolidge, the 30th president of the United States, who came into office upon the death of Warren G. Hardin. Hardin had been elected in 1920 and died in office, and so Coolidge took Hardin's place and then ran again in 1924. And served a full term and then stepped down. And then the other person in Hardin's administration, the person that really started to bring on the Great Depression. It was a depression, but he turned into a Great Depression, furthered by Roosevelt later on, and that was Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Interior in the Hardin administration. But when you mention, John, Calvin Coolidge's name, the reason why Calvin Coolidge be up there as one of the great presidents is because Calvin Coolidge kept his hands off of that which he had no right to be running, and because of that, this hands off made him a reasonably good president. But the only president really that should be considered great is George Washington. I keep saying that because we want to make it appear that these interventionists, such as Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, these interventionists like that were the great presidents. Abraham Lincoln was not a great president, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected the only president really that defied our traditions more than any other president. Our traditions were defied by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We had a 2-term tradition before Roosevelt. But rather than stepping down in 1940, Roosevelt ran for a 3rd term, and we had never had that happen before, where a sitting president would run amidst of the 2-term restraint upon presidential power set into place by George Washington, who stepped down voluntarily when there was no restraint that would cause him to do that, and they were trying to make him king. And George Washington refused to allow that because they had just fought against the king. And George Washington, true to his own revolutionary intent to undo government that was too large, too intrusive, too oppressive, refused to engage in that. And that made George Washington great and stands out among all the presidents.
I remember if
no one stands with George Washington.
I don't even remember. I didn't read the book full. I had friends who were political scientists, and they were actually mostly on the left. I mean, when I was in college. But one friend in particular, he had a real appreciation for Patrick Buchanan because he wrote a book, A Republic, Not an Empire. And basically he outlines, how the...
Patrick Buchanan or J.D.?
I think it was Patrick Buchanan.
Okay.
Patrick Buchanan, and he was he basically says, we allowed this, and he outlined pretty much what we're outlining today. They did this, and now we have to expand beyond our borders, and then every time you do that, there's administration costs, there's administration people, and so we've done that. And I don't know if you ever heard that book or anything else, but I've never read it fully, and my friend quoted books, parts of it, but he was a Democrat, and he really had, because he was kind of a non-interventionist Democrat for foreign policy, and whereas Buchanan was on pretty much parallel with that. So Buchanan did get a lot of support from the old mainstream Democrat thinkers because they also saw government becoming too intrusive because they had this ability to say we have to have this kind of power.
Now, are you talking about the 15th president?
Patrick Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan.
Patrick,
The speechwriter. Yeah.
Oh, the speechwriter.
The speechwriter and stuff. Because he was a great, kind of a good political thinker on his own, and he was a couple of time presidential candidate himself.
Okay.
Patrick, I don't know if you remember him or not, but
yeah, I'm aware of Patrick Buchanan, but I was trying to make sure that I was hearing what you were saying correctly. John, I think we have to be, very, very much aware and very clear about the real movers and the real shakers of society. This thing that we've gotten into right now is that we have given too much of our power away to these politicians who have incrementally over time been just simply placing themselves into a position as to be seen as the motors, the ones that are making society move. And as long as we have that view that they should be so much involved in what goes on in the country rather than what was intended by the framers, and that was that they would be on the sideline pretty much. I mean, in Article 1, it says that the Congress, for example, shall meet at least once a year. That's in Article 1, Section 6. Congress shall meet at least once a year. It doesn't, so you can see what they thought. They thought that government being so much involved in every aspect of American life, that's not what they had in mind. They had in mind to have government under restraints. Article 1, Section 8, and the 18 clauses therein sought to restrict government, to spell out what it could and could not do through the enumeration of powers and the delegation of its authority, and then the further restrained through the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is written against a government that they knew could go out of control. That's why they put the Bill of Rights there. It's not a restraint upon the American people. The Bill of Rights, those 10 amendments were, first of all, it was 22 amendments that was proposed, and they had 10 of them ratified. Those amendments were further restraints placed upon the federal government. Freedom of speech, press, assembly, petition, religion, all of that was intended to tell the government you cannot encroach upon the freedom of the people in these respects. And then to make it clear that they could not do things that were not within the federal authority, they said everything that's not delegated and enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, all the things that's not enumerated and delegated to the federal government, those powers, therefore, will be retained by the states. Retained by the states. The states are dictating the federal government. You will have this authority. You have these particulars you can get involved in, other particulars you cannot get involved in because it's not delegated to you. And the thing that the hammer that the states retained over the federal government ultimately was secession. That if the federal government would not accede to the intent of its limits of power and got out of control, then the ultimate thing the states could do was withdraw, just like they had done in 1776. King George III could not be brought to heel upon the rights of the colonists. Therefore, they took the onus upon saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are born with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And they were putting that right there in the face of King George III. They refused to recognize the rights of those in the colonists, and they were declaring their rights. And ultimately, when they could not get the appeal that they sought, they then withdrew and fought to make the withdrawal necessary. Make it, and not only make it necessary, it already become necessary, made that which was necessary, they sustained it. To sustain that which was necessary, which was, if you want your rights respected, you could not be a part of the British Empire because your rights are not going to be respected. They over there, you over here. And you don't have any appeal over there.
Well, I don't know if some people have heard this or not. I don't want to take too much time, but they actually, Edmund Burke and all those other ones who were British statesmen, actually saw the American Revolution not so much as a revolution, but basically saying, demanding the rights that they had supposed to extend it to them as being British subjects. And so, it was a revolution in the sense that they had the resentment levels that they did there in the French Revolution.
Yeah.
That's why ours didn't degenerate into this horrible nightmare that theirs did, because they had years of kind of dissolving some of the issues and resolving some of the issues rather in England, where in France the monarchy ruled absolute, but they had parliament in England. And Voltaire, when he was living in England, he was so respecting and admiring of the English because they allow this kind of creation of these checks and balances. And Burke and all these other ones basically reminding, they were telling the British government, because he was in power at the time, that this is not a revolution. These people are just saying we're supposed to have this already as being British subjects. So it's a vast difference between.
Edmund Burke was persecuted for taking the side of the colonists. I don't know why we have a problem honoring the framers, because they set into motion a standard for government that would be well for the entire world to follow. That was a standard the world had never seen before. We had never had a government founded upon the principles of all men, founded upon the principles that all men are created equal. It doesn't mean that government is going to carry out that proposition in perfection. Just means that never had it been declared before anywhere at the founding moments of a country that has been declared that all men are born with certain unalienable rights, that they have the right to their own life. Who ever said that before? And the perfection of that is yet to be made. We have to continue to work on that. But the proposition is the founding parts of this country. And I keep going back and saying that until we return to the framers, this country is going to be lost. Continue to be lost. We're lost. This country is lost now.
Did you ever go around a bunch? You've been. I'm asking this question as a rhetorical question because I know the answer on this. But you've been around leftists. When you start quoting the founding fathers, they just roll their eyes and shake their heads. But they'll point to some leftist thinker who has no problem if anybody disagrees with them murdering them. But they think that they'll say, well, the founders, the first thing they're throwing, they're slave owners. Well, that's the first thing they're going to do. Not all of them. That's not entirely true across the board either. I don't think John Adams had slaves. I don't think he did.
No, he didn't.
So,
and John, let's face it, that slavery was an epidemic in the world, and they have made it appear. And when I say they, I mean the leftists, those that want to defame the framers because they don't want to be the embodiment. They don't want to have the country the embodiment of the ideals of the framers. They want to internationalize it. When the framers were talking about that, which they were talking about what Donald Trump is talking about right now, in terms of the nationalist idea of the country, and they want to kill that idea and bring something else about. But the framers were practicing an institution that was in fact worldwide. But if you look at what they had in mind, they recognized slavery, but at the same time, in the recognition of it, because it was already on the land space, and they're trying to create a nation here, they recognized slavery, at the same time sought to limit its reach into the country. And that's why you have Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 in the Constitution. The so-called 3/5 compromise.
What year did they actually ban, prohibit the importation of new?
1800. They wrote the Constitution that in 20 years they would have the right. When they wrote the Constitution in 1787, they put in there that you could not interfere with the slave trade for 20 years, which means then that from 1787 to 1807, no law could be passed that would end the slave trade. But they did it the following year. The Constitution would not have allowed it prior to that. That brings the South into agreeing with the Constitution document. They then postponed it from the ones who signed the document and put it into the future so that the next generation could come behind the framers and then fix some of the problems not fixed in the Constitution Convention. And therefore, in 1808, the slave trade was in fact ended.
Basically, they're allowing for the withering away of that institution. That's what
they were doing. The limitation of slavery, by the way, in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, was a 3/5 clause placed in the Constitution, where it was to restrict the slave states from having representatives based upon the enslavement of people in the federal branch of government. In other words, in the House of Representatives, they wanted to downsize the amount of power in the South because the South wanted to count its slaves as part of its population. And the northern states said no. The non-slave states said no. That makes the document exactly what Fred Douglass said about it. Fred Douglass was arguing with William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was a great abolitionist. I give him a lot of credit for his founding of the paper called The Liberator in 1831. I give Garrison a lot of credit. He was a freedom fighter in terms of him wanting. He was in the same mindset as Edmund Burke and Wilberforce and some of the others in England. And he wanted slavery. He wanted slavery to come to an end. He fought for that. But he did not understand the anti-slavery sentiment in the Constitution. It took Douglass to explain that to him. Douglass had not even been to school. Douglass, that's another thing. Going to school sometimes will impede your ability to see the forest from the to see the distinction between the forest and the trees.
Like, I like what Nietzsche's definition of philosophy is: examination of all prejudices. And basically, that's what education to me is, because let's face it, even if it's a good thing, we have a prejudgment. That's what it basically means, a prejudice because of our past, somebody's telling us of coaching it in the terms this is negative. Yeah. And education does that a lot of times.
Yeah, Douglass had an advantage. Douglass did not have, although he had educated himself, he had not sat in those indoctrination centers and been put into these regions of thinking that limited his ability to be expansive in his thought process. And Douglass told William Lloyd Garrison that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. What Garrison saw was its recognition of slavery, which was a recognition of an institution that already existed. He did not see that it recognized it, and then on the other side of the recognition, it tried to limit its reach, to limit its amount of power in the parliament of the country. It's an anti-slavery document. And Douglass argued that with Garrison. In fact, Garrison's argument with Frederick Douglass is why Douglass changed the name of his paper from the North Star to Fred Douglass's paper, which was changed in 1851. He and Garrison, they say Douglass and Garrison had fallen out by that time because Garrison insisted that in order for the anti-slavery movement to finance and help Douglass with his paper, Douglass had to first of all disavow the notion that the Constitution was a anti-slavery document. Garrison didn't agree with Douglass, Frederick Douglass, on that, and he wanted him to disavow his view that that's the way the Constitution is in fact to be read, as an anti-slavery document. And Garrison would not relent on that, and neither would Frederick Douglass. The two men fell out on that point, because Garrison had a view that any paper that's out there being published that would not take the view that the Constitution was a slave document would not receive any help from the anti-slavery society. And Douglass had to rely upon that for his paper. So Douglass's paper, the North Star, went into, was in fact defunct at that point, could not get the funding. So Douglass then had to make other, the North Star fell apart, and then he had to set up another paper that in fact would he made some alliances with other people that would finance his paper, or help him finance his paper. But Garrison would not help Douglass at that point. But Douglass was absolutely right. The Constitution of the United States, although recognizing slavery, was an anti-slavery document. Let me tell you a point that I had an argument with some people on one of the radio shows. I said that all of the so-called Civil War over the secession movement, all of that war to stop the South from succeeding, all of that fighting toward that end was fought in the South. So, so people ran to tell me What about the Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? That's not in the South. So Moss, you said that all the war, that the so-called Civil War to stop the South from succeeding was fought in the South. So how can that be if there was some fighting in Pennsylvania then? Have you heard of the Gettysburg Address? Yes, I heard about it, had to learn it. But let me tell you what your problem is in that. Because the same problem that Douglas and Garrison were fighting over, the lack of discernment on Garrison's part and the lack of discernment on their part in this case here. Let me tell you the difference between the argument they make with talking about Gettysburg, which, by the way, was fought between November the 1st to November the 3rd, with Lincoln coming there 16 days later and giving the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth for this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I knew it very well. Had to learn it in 8th grade. But let me tell you where your blind spot is in terms of that lack of discernment in this case. The problem is that what they have not discerned, nor these historians have discerned, is that the war to keep the South from succeeding is fought totally in the South. But battles to keep the North from keeping the South from succeeding is fought elsewhere also. In other words, the South is fighting the war to keep the North from keeping from succeeding in other parts of the territorial space. So yes, there are battles going on in Pennsylvania, but that battle in Pennsylvania is not the battle that is being fought to keep the South from succeeding. You cannot keep the South from succeeding from fighting in Pennsylvania, because they're not succeeding in Pennsylvania. They're succeeding in the 11 succeeding states. The North, the South is going there to stop the North from trying to stop the South from succeeding. That's why there are battles in Pennsylvania. The war to stop the South from succeeding is fought in the South. That's a lack of discernment on their part. You see, you have to make a distinction between the war and the purpose of the war and battles that are being fought elsewhere. But the war itself to keep the South from succeeding is fought in the South, because that's what the problem is. The South must be stopped. And that also is the reason why the South moves its capital, which was a military mistake on their part, to move the capital from Montgomery, Alabama, where it was when it was first set up, when they met there in December the 20th, 1860, when they began to meet there, where 7 states will in fact pledge their allegiance to each other to leave the Union, hopefully to leave it in peace, but if not, they're going to pick up their arms to fight for the independence, just like their forefathers had done. The mistake they made, though, was move the capital out of Montgomery to Richmond. The reason why they did that, they were trying to show that the two nations, this is why it's not a civil war, there were two nations here fighting. The two nations could exist side by side. Richmond, right here, and then next door over there where the nation's capital was, they could coexist. They were trying to show the states, the United States that they had succeeded from, that the 11 Confederate states, those states that were created out of the Union states, they called them states out. They said that these states make up the Confederacy. They were putting the Confederacy right next to the capital, right next to Washington, D.C., showing that we could, in fact, be two independent nations existing side by side in what was at one time the contiguous part of the United States. The Confederacy could exist alongside of them. That was a mistake that they made militarily, because now the Union states, Lincoln, who I think should have been, and I still think, and will argue this point, Lincoln should have been brought up on war charges. I'm saying that. Yeah, he should have been brought up on war charges. Because on the battlefields of this country, we had the equivalent of a Holocaust, which is what politicians are doing. I mean, where he turned Americans against each other. Brother, I mean, this is a war where brothers were fighting against brothers and family members fighting against family members. That's what politicians are doing now. That we're just simply doing on the same soil. In this case, that's what they do. They divide people against each other and have them going to war with each other. And Lincoln was a master at that and should have been brought up on war charges, because at the end of this war, which they now try to make it appear this war was over slavery, the fact of the matter is that the Emancipation Proclamation would not have been issued without this war. Without this war, there would have been no Emancipation Proclamation. And I can tell you that by having read and reread and read again and reread it again after that, Lincoln's first inaugural address. Lincoln makes that very clear throughout the address that the South could have no war unless it was made of their own unwillingness to come back into the Union, with its slaves, by the way, intact. And the mere fact that the South turned that down because they had not left for that reason, the mere fact they turned that down shows this war was not over slavery, because they were told they could come back in the Union with their slaves intact, and the South turned down that, which was given in the first inaugural address of the President of the United States at that time, the 16th President of the United States. You can get out of here with that noise. That doesn't work here, because that's not what happened. We had a politician, again, dividing the American people to the point where brothers and family members are fighting each other, and the equivalent of 5 million people, 700,000 persons on the battlefield, and those that was in civilian population died during that 4-year period, the equivalent of a Holocaust. Because 700,000 at that time would be the equivalent of 5 million in modern day terms, based upon the population now and the population then. And we have Lincoln to thank for that. I don't consider him to be a hero, because not one person was freed because of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, we got to get out of here. War is a racket, and also the politics is a racket, and we have to understand that and continue this movement toward taking power at the hands of Washington, D.C. and its politicians that are there. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.